welcome to Biblical Breadcrumbs. It's been a couple weeks since I recorded and released one of these, but now we're here, and I hope my tech didn't break. There we go. We're in the New Testament this time, talking about how to read the Bible. So, we've transitioned over from the Old Testament to the New Testament. This is going to be a much shorter section because of two basic reasons. Number one, the Old Testament is about 2/3 of the Bible. The New Testament is about 1/3 of it. There's just a lot more text to cover in the Old Testament, and so for that reason, the New Testament is going to be a shorter section. The other reason why this is a shorter section is because a lot of the stuff we've covered in the Old Testament is actually very relevant to how we read the New Testament, and so as I discuss some of this, you'll be pretty aware of these things. A gospel, for instance, is an interesting kind of amalgamation between, it's partly narrative, but there's also some prophecy in there, and there's some other poetic license stuff in there. And so if you combine a book like Joshua with a book like Jeremiah, or maybe if you just read the book of Jeremiah, you kind of get a lot of what the gospel's about already. And so since we've already laid a bunch of groundwork, this theoretically shouldn't take as long as it did to do the other sections, or at least it shouldn't take as long to cover the New Testament as it does all the other sections. I think we'll do a section on Gospels, a section on Acts, although that may be a little shorter, a section on the Epistles, and then probably something on Revelation. Who knows exactly how those play out, but probably only about 4 sessions here. Whereas I think the class I have going on this, we've done 7 sessions in the Old Testament as a whole. So, something like that. Today we're talking Gospels, and so we begin by asking the question, what makes a Gospel so unique? What is unique about the Gospel? I say it's like a narrative, and then I say it's like a prophet, and then I say, well, you could just kind of read Jeremiah and then kind of get a picture of the Gospels. And that's not only because Matthew mentions Jeremiah 3 different times in his book, and it's kind of weird. You should go check that out. It's not only something like that. It is just the Gospels in general are unique writings. And sometimes it comes down to this idea, the genre being what's called a bios. We don't have these in the same way that the Greeks had them, at least, and so I'll try to explain a little bit of what I've heard about that. A bios is kind of like a biography. It's a book that's generally written about a specific individual, but it's not like a biography attempts to, in many ways, be a pretty comprehensive view of an individual's life, whereas you have statements like in John, where John says, look, Jesus did a ton of stuff. I'm not trying to write everything that Jesus did. I'm trying to write enough that you believe in him, and then that's good enough, right? I'm not trying to summarize his whole life. When you think about the life of Jesus, we know his birth story, and then we have a story of him being 12 years old, and then he's 30. And we just kind of don't have anything else. A biography about Abraham Lincoln is probably not starting when he's 0 and then skipping time for 12 years and then skipping time for another 18 years until he actually goes and does something. There's probably quite a bit more information there. A bios is not really meant to be this comprehensive historical view. A bios is actually meant to be particularly an emphasis on why the subject is so good and righteous, and you should pay attention to him. From what I've heard, this is something that the Roman emperors would sometimes do when they ascended the throne. People like the Roman empires, or kings in general, they would ascend to the throne, and then they would write a book about how great they were. And it would talk about their origins, and it would talk about where they came from and how they grew up, and it would talk about who they were and what they did and all these great, glorious things. Specifically, when Jesus is being born and working his way up there, some of the emperors were getting on the throne and trying to do stuff like that. From what I've heard, it's usually Caesar Augustus is the one who's cited as having written this great bios about how he is really cool and really different, and he's actually the son of God, and he's like this really impressive guy. He's the son of Zeus. He's like this demigod, which would help to explain why the Gospels are kind of written in this way, because they're reporting on the actual Son of God instead of just what Augustus was saying to make himself sound like the Son of God. When the Gospels are written, there is I don't know if it's a high probability, but from the things I've read and heard and studied, it seems like there's a decent probability they were written to kind of help counter the Roman argument. One of the complaints that you see often in the Gospels is Jesus is, the Gospels and Acts, Jesus is being proclaimed in opposition to the Romans. He is a king. We have no king but Caesar, right? Who should we pay taxes to? Should we pay taxes to God or to Caesar? Should we actually do that? There are a lot of questions about Jesus versus the Roman government, but the very genre of the Gospels themselves is a kind of discussion, a dissertation about the opposition to the Roman government. Augustus declared himself to be the Son of God. Jesus declared himself to be the Son of God, except Jesus is, spiritually speaking, and Augustus was a very impressive man, but just a man. There's a genre thing here there's some interplay with the history at the time. You go forward a little bit and you think about the Gospels. These are about Jesus, sure. He's the subject of them, but they're not written by Jesus. And there isn't much evidence to suggest that Jesus ever had a hand in writing any of them. There are several stories that, like Jesus going out into the wilderness to be tempted for 40 days by the devil. He was out in the wilderness by himself. And so you ask the question, well, how did the apostles know about that? I presume Jesus spoke about that at some point, which is why the apostles would know to write it down. Maybe it was just direct revelation by the Holy Spirit, but I assume Jesus talked about that at some point. I don't really know. I guess that is a question. It could be that is Jesus' specific input on that story, but for the most part, the Gospels are written 30 years or 20 years after he left the earth, and so he wasn't around in the same way to give input in the same way. They're not written by him. Jesus never wrote a gospel. Jesus never wrote a letter that made it into the gospel. Jesus didn't write stuff. It was his followers that came after him that wrote down his teaching. He's kind of like Socrates in that way. Socrates and Jesus are different in a variety of ways, one being Jesus is God and Socrates is just a human being. But one of the ways they're very similar is neither of them ever wrote anything down. The only teachings we have of Socrates come from Plato writing down Socrates' words, at least allegedly. Another distinction we have between Jesus and Socrates is Jesus' words actually got copied down, and Socrates' words, my fan theory is Plato made them all up, but who actually knows? They're about Jesus, but they're not by Jesus. That's something significant about the Gospels. When you go and read Jeremiah, it's about Jeremiah, and it's written by Jeremiah, or it's written by Baruch, because Baruch is taking dictations by Jeremiah. But Jesus didn't do that with the Gospels, and so they're different from that standpoint. Here's an interesting one, is that the Gospels are likely pre-translated. What does that mean? Why did I say it that way? Well, it's complicated. We talked in the very beginning of this class, or I say we. I talked in the very beginning of the series of videos about how how general practice for interpretation is go back to the original language that we have written down and translate that into English. And when you translate, for instance, when you translate the Greek into the Latin, and then you translate the Latin to the English, you're going to get some muddier wording, and you're going to be confused on what's being said. Instead of just translating straight from Greek to English, you're going to have a neater and more accurate translation if it's just Greek to English instead of Greek to Latin to English, or whatever the intermediary language is. One of the interesting things about the Gospels is it's very likely, it's quite possible, Jesus probably was speaking in Jewish Aramaic, in the Hebrew language of the time, because that's the language he grew up using. Now, everybody in those days, or most everybody in those days, was growing up speaking Greek as well. Greek was like the common tongue, that was the trade tongue, but Aramaic was what the Jews used for the original scripture and stuff like that. And so it is likely, or at least quite possible, that Jesus actually spoke everything in Aramaic, and that was the day-to-day language that he used. And then, well, we have, all the Gospels are written in Greek. Those are all the versions that we have are Greek ones. And so it seems like at some point, Jesus' Aramaic words were probably translated into Greek, and those are the originals that we have written down. And then, well, we don't have the actual originals, but those are the original texts that then kept getting copied down in the Greek. So they were pre-translated onto the page, and when they were written down, inspired by the Holy Spirit, the Holy Spirit was, I hope, inspiring the translation process as well. You can see, apparently, if you know Greek really well, which I don't, if you go and read the book of Matthew, I've been told that you can actually see some of that, because the way Matthew expresses things are kind of Hebrew in nature. It's like, it feels kind of Jewish in word order or something like that. Again, I'm not a Greek scholar. I don't exactly know what I'm talking about there, but that's what I've been told, is it kind of feels Jewish, even though it's written in Greek. It has very odd Jewish phrasing, or it has very odd Greek phrasing, because likely Matthew just walked around writing down the Hebrew words that Jesus was saying, Matthew being one of the 12 apostles, and then when it came time to actually write it down for people to read it, he wrote it down in Greek. He wrote down the official version in Greek because that was easier for people to read. So questions on that a little bit, but that's a good possibility. And it was Aramaic to Greek, presumably, in the very beginning. So that's part of the uniqueness of them. The other part is that you have 4 books that are telling the same story, basically. Basically. Go and read Isaiah. How many side references does Isaiah have? We don't have 4 different Isaiahs. We have one Isaiah. We have one Jeremiah. We have one Joshua. We have one Judges. We have Kings and Chronicles, which are 2 different accounts of vaguely the same stories, and there are different details in each account, but they mesh together and they all make sense together. And First Chronicles overlaps with Second Samuel a lot, and Second Chronicles overlaps with Kings, and so you have kind of a cross verification there, but nowhere else in the Bible. I mean, Genesis doesn't have an extra book that's written at that time with the same stories to kind of cross verify it, whereas the Gospels do. It's very interesting from that point of view. They're split into 2 different sections, which are primarily called the Synoptic Gospels. Syn, or S-Y-N, being synonymous is like the word we get from that, is syn, S-Y-N, being this idea of sameness, or like everything is equal, and then optic being how you see stuff. If you have a sight on a gun, it's called an optic. That's a weird application, I guess, for some people, but that's what it is. You have the optic nerve, which hooks your eye to your brain or whatever it does. You have to go see an optician to get glasses. I don't have glasses, so I don't know what I'm talking about. These are the Gospels that see you the same way, is essentially why that's called that. Because if you read through Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're pretty similar. They do have, each one of them has unique stories. Each one of them has unique speeches from Jesus, or at least unique lines that he uses, I believe. Mark is the shortest one, and so it has the most overlap between Matthew and Luke, and it has the least original content to it. But every one of them, basically, even though they do have some deviations, they basically tell the same story, whereas John does not. Matthew starts out with the birth of Jesus. Luke starts out with the birth of Jesus. Mark starts out not really with the birth of Jesus. It just says, hey, Jesus existed, cool. And then it starts in Matthew when Jesus is 30, and it basically starts paralleling Matthew 3 and Luke 3 with the baptism of Jesus, and then the temptation in Matthew 4 and Luke 4 is in Mark 1. It's one verse in Mark 1, but it is there. And then Jesus' teaching in Mark 2 is the teaching in Matthew 9, I think it is, or Luke, whatever it is, Luke 5 or something like that. And so you can see a lot of parallels between those 3. Then John starts out, and it's just not the same at all. John is the weird one out that's like, what in the world was this guy thinking? It's not the same. It's not the same. It's got a very different emphasis, and I think later on in the slides, we better be talking about some of the differences. I forget exactly what I put in the slides, but we'll go over and we'll talk some about the differences later on. But John sees things differently. That's why he's not one of these synoptics. He's the one who's coming in later on to clarify some things that happened. And he's got a different purpose in writing. He's got a different style of writing. He's got different emphases while he's writing. And so John stands out. He sticks out kind of like a sore thumb. It's actually a beautiful compliment to the other Gospels, but at first glance, it's like, whoa, that's kind of weird what you have there. But anyway, synoptics and John being separate. You have a question about the written order of these Gospels. Some people say Matthew's written first. Some people say Mark is written first. And the answer is very clear. The answer is that Matthew is written first because like every church father in the 2nd century is very clear that Matthew is written first. The reason that Matthew is placed first in the New Testament is because everybody said that Matthew was written first, and so they said, well, since Matthew's the first written gospel, we just put it first, and that's why it's first. There is a theory that Mark is the one who's written first, because people who, especially the more modern scholarship kind of view of things, who believe that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were primarily written or written in large part by copying off of each other. It makes sense for Mark to be the first one that's written because it's the shortest one, and so, it's 16 chapters. You don't need as much time to put 16 chapters together, whereas Matthew's 28 chapters, you need a while to put that together. Mark could get his out the door first, and then people think that Mark's skeletal outline for a lot of the events that Jesus did, it serves as the basis for both Matthew and Luke, and Matthew and Luke both supplement it by following after the Q thing, which is a theoretical document we'll talk about at the end, being a collection of Jesus' sayings. And so Matthew and Luke are different compilations of Mark's events and Q's teachings. And then everybody in the 2nd century is like, no, Matthew was written first. We know that. I find it funny that one of the main reasons cited as to why Mark would be written first is because it's the shortest and it's the easiest to assemble, because he would need the least amount of time to do it. And Matthew would take a long time to assemble because, it's a long book. Yeah, and Matthew was one of Jesus's disciples who was with Jesus the whole time. He's a tax collector. He's evidently skilled in writing. He knows what he's doing. I don't really like the show The Chosen that much. I've seen the first season of it, and I was like, okay, it's somewhat fine, but it's not really something I would recommend to anybody. But one of the funny lines from the first episode is when Jesus calls Matthew, and Matthew comes out of the tax collector booth with his little writing pad and his pen, and Jesus is like, oh yeah, you'll need that. Yeah, because Matthew's walking around and writing down everything Jesus does, especially if Jesus is doing these things, and like many people think from looking at Matthew, if Matthew did write this all down in Jewish Aramaic, why is he writing it down in Jewish Aramaic? Because he's writing it down as Jesus is talking. You say that Matthew needs a bunch of time to assemble his gospel, and Mark got his gospel out by the mid-50s or the mid-60s, depending on how you look at it. Matthew was writing his gospel since AD 30 when Jesus started speaking. He had 20 years on Mark before Mark got his together. So don't try telling me Mark had to write it first because Mark was shorter. Matthew had 2 decades on him. So get dunked on, people who think differently on that. It's not for sure. God didn't come down and reveal to me that Matthew was written first. But when everybody in the early centuries say it, and the logic itself dictates that that's how it is, I don't buy the modern explanation that actually we know better than the people who were there watching it being written. Yeah, you do have a question on when these things are written, and it is a good question, and people suppose all sorts of different stuff to it. I am one of those. I believe it was probably written in the 50s, is probably about when they were being assembled. Mark, it seems, seems to have a pretty solid date around 54 or something like that. Maybe it's 56. Matthew, I believe, is written first. At least a Jewish rough outline of it was written first, long before that. And so you do have those two already set. Luke is written, Luke is commissioned in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and Acts chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, or something like that. Luke and Acts are very clearly written for a guy named Theophilus, who seems to have commissioned the writing of the Gospel and the book of Acts as a history to kind of explain who Jesus is and what this church thing is and how he should be dealing with them. And so we kind of when was that happening? Well, Luke and Acts runs up through AD about 60. It's something around there when Paul was, maybe it's 61, when Paul was in prison in Rome for the first time. It could be that those things happened, and then Paul got released from prison and went and maybe preached in Spain, says maybe some early church tradition, and then he got arrested a second time, and then he ended up getting his head cut off in about AD 63, or maybe 64, depending on how you date, the fall of Rome and the burning of Rome, the Great Fire of Rome that Nero blamed on the Christians, and he used that as an excuse to execute Peter and Paul, or something like that. It could be that Luke is writing after that and just doesn't put any of the rest of that history in, but I don't see a reason to believe that specifically, so much as Luke stayed with Paul in Rome. We have evidence of that from Paul writing in 1st and 2nd Timothy. Luke was with Paul all the time there. It seems like he was just writing that book while he was there, and so I would assume Luke was being written in the early 60s. John is written later. John, there are some suggestions that John is probably written because the last remaining disciples at the time being Andrew, Bartholomew, and maybe like Philip. I don't remember the third one. They're the last remaining disciples, and they come to John in the late 90s or the mid to late 90s maybe, and say, hey, John, you need to write one last gospel to help clarify some of the things that people did not understand from the previous gospel accounts. And so John comes back in and does that. Part of the evidence for that would be John uses names more freely than the other Gospels do. Matthew and Mark and Luke, at least a couple of them, tell us that somebody cut the ear off the high priest in the Garden of Gethsemane. I wonder who that was. And John comes around and says, yeah, it was Peter who cut the ear off. Well, why does John say that? Because at that point in the 90s, when I think John is writing it in the 90s, even if it's written in the 70s or something like that, Peter was crucified in 63 or 64. He's dead. You can't do anything to him. Yeah, it was Peter, right? We don't need to witness protect him anymore. He's fine now. There's nothing you can do to him. Yeah, it was Peter who cut his ear off. People are going to have rumors about that. People are going to be wondering about who did what. And John comes in and just kind of clarifies it for people who have already read the Gospels before. Other evidence of that is of his kind of clarifying process for people who have already read the Gospels is stuff like in John. It's John. I think it's John 11. It identifies Mary as the one who like bathed Jesus' feet in perfume or whatever it was. That doesn't happen until John chapter 12. Like, how is he identifying this woman based on something she's going to do 80 verses later? It's because the people who are reading John have already read Matthew, Mark, and Luke a lot. They've already had exposure to the previous Gospels, and John is coming around and kind of spelling things out for them and mapping things out in a different way. And so, yes, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all written seemingly at similar times, probably around the 50s. AD, and John, I'm guessing, is written around the 90s. He's written more to clarify some things. That's it for some of the four Gospels and their differences. I guess we'll talk more about their differences right here. One of the major differences you find in each Gospel is the historical concern being a question of who is Jesus actually. Do I have anything else? No, I don't. So I probably should have looked that up and figured out what that was actually saying. All of these Gospels have different pictures of who Jesus is. For instance, if you read Matthew, there's a very strong emphasis on, and we'll talk about this later, there's a very strong emphasis on the kingship of Jesus. Whereas in Mark, there's this very strong emphasis on kind of the messiahship of Jesus. Matthew opens chapter 1, verse 1. This is the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of God. Or the son of David, the son of Abraham. My bad. Boom. David. Jesus is the king, and he promptly in chapter 1 names out all the kings of Judah and then says Jesus is the fulfillment of that line. Whereas you go to Mark, and it's Mark 1 and verse 1. It's the story of Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That being two claims, Jesus the Christ, which is a claim that's established in Mark chapter 8, I do believe, at the Transfiguration or the Great Confession when oh my goodness, I'm running out of words. At the Great Confession when Peter says, "You are the Christ," that's confirmed. That's a reference back to Mark 1 and verse 1. And at the crucifixion, when the Roman soldier says, "Truly this was the son of one of the gods," that would be also a reference back to Mark 1 and verse 1. And so Mark sets out a organizational structure for his book in chapter 1 and verse 1 and proceeds to organize the book around this idea of who is the Christ and who is the Son of God and what does that actually mean. You have something like Luke, which it focuses more on how Jesus serves the lowly. One of the points, I was studying Luke chapter 2 with a group just last night, and we were talking about why does Matthew, in Matthew chapter 2, record the wise men, the magi from the east, coming to see Jesus, whereas Luke chapter 2 records the shepherds in the fields coming to see Jesus? One of those is great and fit for a king, because Matthew's account is all about how Jesus is the king, but Luke's account is all about how Jesus is humble, and he serves those who aren't important. There's a special emphasis placed on women. There's a special emphasis placed on servants. There's a special emphasis placed on Gentiles. There's a special emphasis placed on all these problem groups, especially in Luke, because he's talking about Jesus more as the servant than anything else. And John ultimately is talking about Jesus more like he's God. It's not that he's not God in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're all very clear that Jesus is God. But John is the one who begins by saying, okay, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And by the way, the Word was Jesus, because Jesus is God. Get that in your heads. And then he goes on from there and the rest of chapter 1. And so the historical concern, who is Jesus, becomes a major question, and it changes the emphasis of the books based on what they are emphasizing. There's a theological concern here, which is, was he God? They're trying to answer this question of, was he God? How did he display that? Did he hint at that? What did he say? What did he do? How did he live? How can you evaluate whether or not he was? And so there is a claim that's being made, yeah, he's God, in all of these versions, or in all of these different gospels that are being written, and they're trying to answer that theological question. There's also a communication concern that leads the charge on why some of these books are different. A big question is who's going to listen to the book, and so the language changes based on who they think is going to listen to it. One of the common differences you'll see named if you look in differences of the Gospels is Matthew has a lot of quotations from the Old Testament. Mark does not. He has some, but not that much. Luke has some, but again, not that much, comparatively to Matthew. Matthew is very much emphasizing the Old Testament, and it seems to be because he's trying to reach a different audience than the other ones are. Mark has a section, or has a couple of notes where, I think it's Mark chapter 7, the first few verses, where Mark has to explain some Jewish customs of hand washing and how they went about it. And he has to explain those because he's not writing to Jews, it seems. He's writing to another group who doesn't have that Jewish background, and so he's providing his readers a Jewish background. Matthew is written in a very Jewish way, with the language, the syntax being translated over, but also with all the references to the Old Testament, whereas Luke, it kind of just writes it in a more general way. He's writing to a Gentile, Theophilus. I assume that's an individual, not a group. You can disagree if you want to. I don't really care. He's writing not to a Jewish guy, he's writing to somebody else, and so his language is more general than the other ones are. And John is, again, writing to people who have already read this stuff before, or who have read the stories of Jesus before in the other Gospels, and he's using their familiarity with it to make new points about who Jesus is, and to clarify some things about where Jesus comes from. But despite all these differences, there are basically some core unifying ideas. All of the Gospels are written to establish the facts about Jesus, and the facts are complementary to each other. They reference different facts, they reference different points of view, but they all tie together, and they establish a very fleshed out version, or a very fleshed out picture of who Jesus was as he lived. All of these are written to establish the teachings of Jesus and show you who Jesus is and how Jesus taught and the words he said. And all of these are written to be witnesses to Jesus. They are, Luke, it's an explicit claim in the first few verses of Luke chapter 1. I went and sought eyewitness testimony to see the truth about these things and who was involved in all this different stuff. Luke is very clear, I wanted witnesses to this, and all of the Gospels are built to stand as witnesses to who Jesus is. We need to talk about some context for the Gospels next. If you're going into the Gospel, you need to know a few different things that are going around at that time. Namely, you would have to start with the historical context. We're talking about the first century, and by the way, it's called the first century because our entire calendar, the Gregorian calendar, I believe it's called, is based on a rough approximation of when Jesus was born. In all likelihood, it's probably a couple of years off, but, whatever. pretty close for a guy in Britain in like the thousands or whatever it is. Or, well, it's thousands because we now call it AD, which is in the year of our Lord. Fun fact, or side note, tangent, I guess it is, if people used to call it BC and AD, BC being before Christ and AD being Anno Domini, which is Latin for in the year of our Lord, which is ever since Christ was born, basically. Modern scholars like to use the terms BC and BCE and CE, which are before Common Era and the Common Era, because they're trying to rip Jesus out of everything. So I don't do that. I still use BC and AD because it was good enough for everyone throughout the last 1,000+ years of history, because we all agreed that Jesus was real until people came along and tried insisting that he's not real, which is just, quite frankly, a little bit silly, and I'm not going to deal with that right now. Historical context puts this in the 1st century AD as we think about it, and that comes with a few different things. Well, I guess I'll just spell out the list, and then we'll go through some of those specific things. When you put it in the 1st century, you're putting it in a geographical context, which is the land of Israel, specifically. Jesus did sojourn a little bit in what's it called? In Egypt, as he was an infant. His parents took him there to keep him safe from Herod. There are various moments where Jesus goes into Samaria, but for the most part, he's living in the land of Israel. Samaria is this little section in the middle of the land of Israel in the south, and the land of Israel in the north, and then Samaria is just this section with a bunch of Samaritan half-breeds that none of the Jews actually like. And so Jesus spends a little time there, but not that much. There is a geographical context to where he lived, and that ends up being fairly important. There is a religious context to where he lived. He's living in the time of Second Temple Judaism. He's living in the time of the Pharisees and Sadducees, which didn't exist in the Old Testament, but when you open the New Testament, they are front and center. He's living in the time of synagogues, which were never commanded or built in the Old Testament, but when you get to the New Testament, they're very, very frequent. That was something that the Jews established in the 430 years of silence between the end of Malachi and the beginning of the New Testament. Actually, well, it wasn't exactly that. They established synagogues over in Babylon, it seems, when they were away from Jerusalem and couldn't worship in the temple. They established these meeting areas to come together and worship, to sing, to pray, to read the scripture, just not to do the sacrifices, because those were temple exclusive. And the religious context has developed a lot in Jesus' day. And so if you just read straight through from Malachi to Matthew, you're going to be a little bit confused, because we are not starting in the same place that we left off. There were 400+ years of development in that area in that time, especially with Jewish religion. There's a political context to this. Rome is the ruling power. Jerusalem, it's not that Israel didn't exist as a country, but they did exist under Roman occupation and rule. Judah used to rule themselves. When you open the New Testament, Herod's in charge. He's one of the Edomites. He bought his kingship from the Romans and paid the Romans enough money that they left him as the local king, and they put him in charge of Jerusalem. And so there's a political background that's going on here. There's authorial context to this. Matthew is trying to talk to you about how Jesus is the king. Luke is trying to write for a slightly different purpose. John is trying to write for a slightly different purpose. There are different contexts to what the writers are putting in there. And when the writers are grouping things in their Bible, they're grouping it differently. You have to talk about textual context. Some of the Gospels are written to be chronological, and some of the Gospels have chronological sections, whereas others of the Gospels are more written to be thematic and have thematic sections. I happen to think they are mostly chronological for all of them, but different people will disagree on that. And some people think it's more thematic in their grouping, and sometimes it is. Did Jesus' cursing of the fig tree happen as he was going into the temple on the second day of the last week of his physical life here before the crucifixion? Or did it happen as he was on his way out? Or did it happen on the first day as he was going in? Or did it happen on the third day as he was going in? People have different discussions about that, because it's framed differently in Matthew versus Luke, I think it is, primarily, or maybe it's Matthew versus Mark. Matthew says one thing, and then Mark puts it in a slightly different order. Which one of them is strictly the right chronology? Well, I don't know. Which one of them is more thematic? Well, I don't know. You go to read the the temptation of Jesus in Matthew chapter 4 and Luke chapter 4. In Matthew, there is an escalation, a steady escalation of height and intensity. Matthew, it starts with the small scale, turn these stones into bread. It moves up to a medium scale. Okay, you're on the roof of the temple. Go jump off the roof of the temple. It moves up to the large scale, which is you're on top of the mountain. I'll give you all the nations of the whole world. In other words, do something for yourself, do something for your people, do something for the whole world. And there's this escalation there, whereas Luke's account in Luke chapter 4 records that it is, do something for yourself, here's bread. Now you're up on a mountain, do something for the whole world. Okay, well, now you're on the temple, just do something for your people. I think Matthew is probably more thematic, and I like how it preaches better, although then why did Luke record it differently? Well, maybe Luke has the strict chronology, and Matthew has the thematic emphasis there. Maybe, I don't know how the devil tried to sell it to Jesus. I don't know what order he used. There's kind of a question there. Different gospels will have different textual contexts for things and have them set in different places, and you draw different lessons from them based on their relative context. So just know that going in, the author has an intent behind how he writes out his book. And of course, the audience intent is going to be different. A gospel that is written to the Jews is going to be different than a gospel that's written to Romans, is going to be different than a gospel written to Greeks. They're all going to have their own positives and negatives, their own great things and their own pitfalls, because they're just different. They're written for different people. What do you say about Jesus' teachings then? Because Jesus' teachings remain remarkably consistent. Jesus has a certain style of teaching as you go through the Gospels, and they're represented in a bunch of different ways. You can talk about the hyperbole he uses. Hyperbole is a fancy word for saying overstatement. If your right eye causes you to sin, cut it out and throw it away from you. I don't think Jesus actually wants you to cut your eye out, but there's a lesson to learn from that, right? It's not that Jesus is saying, well, you should just mutilate the part of your body that you don't particularly have good control of. God is saying have control over your body, right? Pay attention to the things that you're doing and be wise and be righteous. There is a lot of hyperbole in Jesus' statements. So be careful with that. Not everything he says is strictly literal, and that's where we get to talk about some other things. He tells parables. Parables are generally invented stories that are meant to communicate a spiritual truth. Parables are not something that actually happened. Jesus is not like looking at a farmer, and the farmer throws a bunch of seed on the road, and Jesus is like, that was a stupid thing he did. Let's make fun of him for that. No, Jesus didn't do that. Jesus was thinking about, how do I communicate a story to something? Well, y'all know what farmers do. Let's talk about farmers, right? There's this farmer, and some of his seed fell on the road, and that was bad, right? He's making an application that they're familiar with to try and teach a deeper kind of a point. Not a literal story that actually happened, but he's trying to make a good point with it. He talks in metaphor a lot. I mean, parables are part of this. Hyperbole is part of this. He talks, again, it's not like a literal one-to-one thing. He uses word pictures. He uses ideas. He paints a picture in your mind and says, hey, do that thing or don't do that thing. When he talks to, when he's asked, who is my neighbor? He doesn't just say, your neighbor is anyone who is around you. He tells the story of the Good Samaritan and then says, you know what I just described? You should go do that thing. Like, that's what it looks like, right? It's a metaphor. It's a parable, yeah, but it is a metaphor. He's painting a picture and then telling them other things to do about it. Jesus talks in poetry. He talks in prophecy. Again, if you read Jeremiah and some of the prophetic outbursts of Jeremiah, and then you come to Jesus, you can read some of those same kinds of things. Poetry is, by definition, not necessarily inherently literal in every sense, so be careful when you interpret that. Some of Jesus' teachings, especially like Matthew 24, is often interpreted as strictly literal, and a lot of that seems to be futuristic, apocalyptic kind of language that is more poetic than it is strictly literal for every phrase. He also asks a lot of questions. When people come up to him and ask, by what authority do you do these things? He doesn't give them an answer. He says, I'll ask you a question, and if you answer my question, then I'll answer your question. And so Jesus teaches in a variety of different ways. Don't be surprised when you run across stuff like this. There's a lot more than that that we could keep on going into, but it doesn't do us much good to delve into every little tiny detail because that's just going to take us forever, and we've already been here for 39 and a half minutes. So when you're reading gospel, you should keep some things in mind. You should keep in mind the different emphases between the kingship that Matthew emphasizes, the messiahship that Mark emphasizes, the servantship that Luke emphasizes, and the godhood that John is emphasizing. You should keep in mind that these can be read individually and they can be read in unison with the other gospels that exist. There are 4 gospels. They do in many ways co-witness over the same events, but you do need to be careful with that. There are books you can get somewhere on my shelf back here. Well, I used to have it. I think I might have actually gotten rid of it because I don't like it that much. There are these things called like the Harmony of the Gospels, where some human being has gone in and taken Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and he's taken all of these events, and he gives you the Matthew passage, the Mark passage, the Luke passage, and the John passage, if and when they're in the same, if and when they all talk about the same thing. Some Gospels don't address a certain story or a certain speech, and so they're excluded from that, but they'll take, Matthew's account of this story and John's account of this story, and they'll put them side by side so that you can read them together. There can be value in reading the Harmony of the Gospels approach and reading different vantage points on the same story and realizing how they cross communicate and how they corroborate each other and how all the details fit together and actually make sense. There is value in reading like that. The problem with that is when you only ever read it and you read every version of the feeding of the 5,000. There are 4 of them. When you read every version of the feeding of the 5,000 and then you make some generic points about how Jesus fed some people, you kind of miss the individual focus that Matthew had when telling that story and the context that Mark had when telling that story and the reason Luke was telling that story and why John thought it important to tell that story. You can read them individually, and then you miss some of that cross coordination, cross collaboration, and how they kind of emphasize each other's truth. But if you only ever read them together, then you miss the individuality of each of the individual points being made, and I find that to be a disservice. So I tend to read them separately, but I will read them together on occasion, or make reference to them to give a fuller picture of the situation, even if I do particularly study from or preach one particular passage at a time, instead of trying to unify all of them together and then preach some kind of garbled amalgamation of one super gospel instead of the 4 gospels that we actually have. God gave us 4 separate accounts for a reason. Be sure that you are reading the separate accounts separately at least as much as you're reading them all together, I think is a valid way to say that. And I would say probably read it a lot more than reading all of them together at the same time, because God didn't put them all together in one super gospel. He gave us 4 different gospels that are distinct and that are making different points. Okay, you do have to ask a question of the origins of the gospel, or, you don't have to ask one, but I guess I'll explain a little bit of it. The Synoptics versus John, where did that come from? Well, there are similarities between them, and there are clarifications instead. Synoptics are a lot of similarities, and a lot of their things match, whereas John seems to come in at a later point. I've really talked about all this already, and so I don't have to go into it again. John seems to come in at a later point and clarify a lot of the earlier points that people may have missed in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or they misunderstood in some way, and they just didn't quite get it, and so John comes back around and says, no, actually, Matthew was the guy who cut the ear off, and both Matthew and John raced to the tomb, and I beat him, actually. That's a whole thing in John chapter 20, in going to see the tomb. Who saw Jesus first? What order did these things happen? And John comes in and clarifies quite a bit of it. And so you'll see some of those differences, and if I wanted to delve into the differences, I would just have to go study John again, and I will do that at some point. I will make videos on that at some point, but not right now. There's a high likelihood these are drawn from a core oral tradition, which is why a lot of the stories do share a pretty similar vibe. Stories in the old days, especially before everything was written down, especially before we had smartphones to capture everything, allegedly, to capture everything for us so that we don't actually have to think and memorize stuff anymore. People's attention spans have degraded. People's ability to capture and store and like contemplate information. My ability to speak is gone now. But people's ability to capture information is much decreased because of, all sorts of distractions like videos that you watch on your phone or you listen to. So sorry about that, but here we are. A lot of times in the old world, these were drawn from a core historical, like oral tradition where people would pass down the same story. And you can do research on this. Oral traditions are very, very reliable and very, very accurate when they have been preserved in societies for generations to generations. They would have people would listen to these things, and back in the days, especially when a lot of people couldn't read or at least couldn't write or barely did it on a regular basis, oral tradition was the way you passed stuff around. And so the only stories that they told were oral stories. That's why everything is told that's why a lot of stuff is told in like poems and stuff, because that's a lot easier to memorize than just a straight up history book. And so it's very likely that the core oral or the core units of the gospel were individual oral tradition where, I need to hear something on greed. Well, Jesus talked to this rich young ruler one time. Let me recite the story for you. And then you can recite the rich young ruler passage. And then Matthew got that, and Mark got that, and Luke got that, and they kind of wrote those down, which would explain a lot of their similarities and why they play out roughly the same, although Mark is dealing with probably Peter's recollection of that incident, and Luke is dealing with Paul's thought on that incident, probably, and Matthew is dealing with the first-hand witness on that incident, and so they're all recording slightly different details around the same core story. That's about all I have for origins of the Gospels. There you go. Hopefully that is useful. Applications is, be sure to get to the real point of the gospel. The Gospels are easy to miss the point of. You take something like the rich young ruler. Jesus saw a man who loved his stuff too much and said, you should give your stuff away, right? You cannot serve both God and mammon, but the actual practical example of someone who's trying to serve both God and mammon. Jesus is there to say you can't do that. Give your stuff away, right? Let's test that and see if you actually want to serve God or not. That's the real point of the story. The real point of the story is not everyone should give away all the money that they've ever had. If they do that, it makes it pretty hard to follow the commandment of God later on when Paul is writing, and Paul says, if someone does not provide for his own family, he's worse than an unbeliever. If I've given all my money and possession and house and stuff away, I guess I'm worse than an unbeliever then. So which one do I follow? Well, the answer is Jesus wasn't saying give all your stuff away. Jesus was reinforcing the message of you cannot serve God and mammon, or God and money. Be sure you actually get the real point instead of trying to over-apply the Gospels and absolutely miss what they're talking about. The other thing is you need to understand, going into the Gospels, you really need to understand the nature of God's kingdom. That being, it's a spiritual thing. That being also, part of it is now, part of it was then, and part of it was not quite yet. Jesus makes a bunch of distinctions between the kingdom and when the kingdom is coming and in what form it will come. He says in some small part, the kingdom was there when Jesus was there because he's the king. But more than that, the kingdom would be there after Jesus died and rose again and then ascended to heaven when the church entered in Acts chapter 2. That was the kingdom. But even so, there's still a part of the kingdom that has not arrived yet, which is the complete and utter domination of God over the entire world on earth as it is in heaven. One day when we get to heaven and we are under God's rule where there is no more evil anymore, we will realize, even though the church is the kingdom of God, it's not the entirety of the kingdom of God, and we haven't had the entire, total, full revelation of God's kingdom yet. The nature of God's kingdom is very curious and kind of controversial, especially in Jesus' day, but he talks about it a lot. And so if you don't understand what the kingdom is, you're not going to understand a lot of his messages, and a lot of his parables are, the kingdom of heaven is like this. And if you don't understand the nature of the kingdom of God, you're going to miss a lot of stuff from it. I think those are all the applications. Instead, we have to talk about two common problems that exist when we're talking about the Gospels. A lot of people, when we talk about the Gospels, the New Testament Gospels, like the Gospels, like the real ones, want to shift the conversation and talk about something else. A lot of people like to talk about this idea of Q. I already mentioned it briefly. The brief overview of Q is the idea that Mark was written first, Matthew was written based on Mark, and Luke was also written based on Mark. Both of them share a core narrative that Mark has, because Mark put together a skeletal outline of the actions Jesus took, and Matthew and Luke both kind of took that outline. But then how do you explain the teaching in Matthew and the teaching in Luke being so similar? Because Jesus doesn't teach that much in Mark, so how do Matthew and Luke overlap? There is this theory that floats around that there was a mysterious document called Q, or called Codename Q, because we don't know what it was actually called, because it doesn't exist, but whatever, we'll leave it. I'll rail against it in a little bit. The idea being there is this document, Codename Q, as a stand-in, and what it says is it is a compilation of all of the teachings of Jesus throughout the time that he was here. Mark is the bedrock foundation of Matthew and Luke's action, like the action narrative that Jesus goes through, and this Q document is the foundation of the teaching elements that Jesus goes through in Matthew and Luke, and that's why Matthew and Luke's accounts are so similar. My response to that is very simple. If Jesus actually existed and he taught these things, and Matthew and Luke are both writing down what he taught, of course they're going to be pretty similar, because they're all writing down what Jesus taught. And I don't understand the need. I do understand people want to insist there is a document that this stuff is based on, but the actual fact is I really don't think there was a document. Matthew wrote these things down when they came out of Jesus' mouth, and Luke was familiar with them from interviewing a bunch of people who were around Jerusalem at the time that Jesus was teaching. There is no Q document. A hypothetical sayings of Jesus document doesn't exist, or at least it doesn't to any knowledge that we have. That is a supposition made by human beings, which, even if it's true, I don't know what it means, but also if somebody tells you there's a Q document that we don't have, then I don't know what to tell you. That's human supposition and probably incorrect, or at least there's no reason that there should be a Q document, and so people who insist that there is one don't seem to be understanding, there's no reason why there should be one, so I don't know why there would be. Anyway, a lot of times conversations about the gospel get derailed into, what about this hypothetical document that doesn't exist? And if you spend your time in the gospel arguing about something that doesn't exist, you've done a massive disservice to the gospel. Don't do that. The other common problem that comes up are additional gospels, allegedly. And these are stuff like the Gospel of Thomas, Infancy Gospel of Thomas, although nobody really takes that one seriously. Nobody should take Gospel of Thomas seriously, but some people do, primarily because they haven't read it, because once you read the Gospel of Thomas, you realize it's completely made up. There are a lot of people in the 2nd century that are already verifying, look, we have 4 Gospels. They were written by the apostles and people close to the apostles. These ones are trustworthy, and you have a lot of other nut jobs who are writing Gospels, and they are not authorized. Do not listen to them. This is all just made up stuff. Gospel of Thomas, for instance, Thomas died probably around 70, maybe 74, over in India, as tradition says, stabbed to death with a spear or impaled with a spear. And then the Gospel of Thomas pops up in the 120s to 140s, so 50 to 70 years after he died, claiming to have been written by him, and it contains a bunch of preposterous stuff that doesn't sound anything like Jesus, like any of the other Gospels, and everybody in the 2nd century said, no, that's not real. Don't listen to that. That's stupid. Why would anyone think that was the real thing? When somebody comes up to you and tries to tell you that the Gospel of Thomas is really important and we should listen to the Lost Gospels, they've read a little bit too much of the Da Vinci Code and they haven't understood the actual truth. So educate yourself on, just go read those Gospels. Just ask yourself, does this actually sound anything like God? And you'll realize those are all fake, and hopefully arm yourself with the ability to refute other people who are preaching things that are not true. So that's what you have with the Gospels. We'll wrap it up there. Go ahead next time and delve into Acts and talk a little bit about the history behind that book. I have taken a couple weeks off of this, of posting this series, of recording these videos, and so we're mostly on track with the auditorium class, although with how long this went, the auditorium class will probably lag behind another week, but whatever, we'll get there when we get there. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed, hope you benefited, hope you learned something useful throughout the session, and I will see you on Friday. We're finishing up the Sermon on the Mount, and then next week for whatever it is then. Bye.